Welcome back to the channel, guys. Today we're going to talk about what I wish someone would have told me about fishing a squarebill crankbait. You would think it's a very simple bait. You cast it out, reel it in, and catch fish. And while that does work and you will catch a lot of fish doing that with a squarebill crankbait, we're going to talk about some tips and tricks that I've learned over the years of fishing a squarebill crankbait that'll hopefully have you catching more fish in no time. While a squarebill crankbait is an excellent bait to catch fish all throughout the year, right now we have prime time conditions. We're fishing out here in the pre-spawn with dirty water behind me here. And we have fish moving up, ready to start feeding, and then eventually start spawning here in the near future. So excellent time to fish a squarebill crankbait. You'll notice I have a red one on here today, but we'll talk all about the color here as we go through today's video. So we're going to break it down into 3 sections. We're going to talk about the rod, reel, and line setup. Pretty important when it comes to fishing a squarebill. Not necessarily something you need a specialty setup for, but it's a couple things you need to pay attention to on that. We're going to break down the entire bait selection, different baits you can use, colors, when you should use what, and then finally we're going to go out on the water. We're going to show you how to fish it, and hopefully we'll catch a couple fish along the way. So let's get right into it with rod and reel setup. So when it comes to your rod and reel setup, I keep mine very simple when it comes to fishing a squarebill crankbait. It's the same setup that I would use to fish pretty much any other shallow diving crankbait. I get a regular 7-foot medium heavy moderate action crankbait rod, or moderate fast action crankbait rod. This one happens to be the Cashin Core Crankbait Series rod. It's the 7-foot medium heavy. It works excellent for these squarebills. It allows you to throw those lighter baits, especially if you throw a smaller version. It works great for that, or you can even throw those bigger squarebills as well, and it'll handle that. It's not the heaviest backbone rod. You're not going to be able to throw deep crankbaits with it, but squarebills, small flat-sided crankbaits, other little crankbaits like that are perfect for this. Honestly, I have a squarebill on this rod 99% of the time, and I have a rod just for that because the squarebill will almost work all the time. And then when it comes to your reel, you want something with a slower gear ratio, and you want something with a bigger spool so you can make a far cast. Sometimes we are doing some target casting, and that's actually what we're going to do today, but you can also parallel riprap and stuff like that. So you need a reel that has some capacity so you can make a long cast if you need to. So I have the Shimano Curado 200K right here. This is the 6:2:1 gear ratio. It allows me to reel faster because I like to reel fast, but it doesn't move the bait very fast. It doesn't have a high gear ratio or line retrieve, so inches of line retrieve. So I can reel a little bit quicker and feel like I'm power fishing and covering water, and it's keeping the bait moving slow enough and staying in the strike zone. So then I spool this up with straight 12-pound test fluorocarbon. Biggest thing is your choice in line size, specifically line diameter when you're fishing with a squarebill crankbait. So there's a few options you can go with your line when you're fishing a squarebill. You can go all the way down to like 10-pound test. That's going to get your bait the deepest. I usually don't do that just because I'm fishing a squarebill around cover almost 95% of the time. So I want something that has a little bit more abrasion resistance. I'll go up to the 12. That's my starting point. If I'm fishing really shallow, super muddy water, super heavy cover, squarebill is an excellent bait to deflect off of rock and wood, so you can get it up there in some really tight cover and still fish this bait effectively. I can go up to 15, 17, even 20-pound test and get that bait in there and keep from breaking off. The key with that is these baits usually go about 4 or 5 foot deep on 10 or 12-pound tests. So if you go up to 15-pound test, you might get it like 3 to 4 foot deep. If you go to 17 or 20, you might get that bait only 2 to 3 foot deep. So you can take the same crankbait, put it on different pound tests, and fish it in different areas more effectively and get it to deflect off of cover properly. So line selection is probably the biggest, most important key when it comes to fishing your squarebill crankbait. The rod and reel is nice as long as you have that slower gear ratio, but you can even fish the faster gear ratio, and as long as you have a moderate action or a moderate fast action to your rod, you're going to do just fine. So make sure you focus on your line selection the most, and not all line brands are created equal. Some line test, you got to look at the line diameter. It might be 0.012 inches for a 12-pound test. I'm just making up numbers here because I don't actually know what it is off the top of my head, but it could be 0.012 inches for 12-pound test from Seagar, and you could go get Suffolk's 12-pound test and it could be 0.014 for the same thing. That bait will actually run shallower on that 12-pound test just because that line diameter is thicker. So pay attention to that as well when you're choosing your line. Next, let's get into a little bit of bait selection and talk about that. that. So when it comes to bait selection, I keep it fairly simple with my Squarebill crankbaits. I focus on two things, size and color. There's sound out there as well, but size and color are your most important things and allow you to mimic the forage that those fish are feeding on. So the first thing is going to be your size. It depends on how big your bait fish are. Most of the time, I'm going to go with a 1.5 size Squarebill, or the 6 cents versions that I use, that would be the 50X. That's the most common size that you can get. That's going to be the all-around size. If you only get one size of Squarebill, that would be the one to get. You can still mimic small bait fish if you need to, but you can still get big bites on it. So that's a good size to start with. They make a 25 mini, which is excellent for when you're mimicking those small bait fish. I fish the rivers a lot. Excellent bait down there when those bait fish are very small, after shad spawn, middle of the summer, times like that when those bait fish haven't grown all the way up yet, but the fish are targeting on that. That's when you're going to need that smaller size Squarebill. And then if you're trying to catch some really big bass, or you have some really dirty water and need your bait to stand out, or the shad or other bait fish are just really big in your area, you can go to the 100X, or the Mini Mag is an excellent choice as well. Those are some very big Squarebills. They'll put off a lot of vibration and they'll get those fish to find that bait, but it'll allow you to catch some bigger fish on that bait. So usually if I'm staying in the ballpark of something, I'm just going to go with the 50X. It gets the job done almost 95% of the time. Sometimes I'll play around with it if I notice I'm not getting as many bites, but those fish are keying on small bait fish or bigger bait fish. That's when I'll start playing with that. But I don't usually venture too far out into those as often. I have the most of my selection in this regular size right here. When it comes to colors, that's where I play a little bit more. So you have to have a shad pattern Squarebill. It could be a chrome side, it could be a white, it could be whatever. Has to have something that looks like a shad. That's going to be almost your #1 Squarebill pattern throughout the entire course of the year, because usually you're fishing around rocks and the shad will just congregate around rocks most often. The second color that I really like to have is going to be a red or orange like this. If you're fishing in the pre-spawn, have to have it. It's a key bait. It catches a ton of fish, especially in this dirty water. It stands out and allows those fish to find that bait. So it's super important to have a red Squarebill like that. Two other colors that I really like to have. One is a chartreuse, whether it's a blue black or a black back. If you have dirty water and those fish are feeding on shad, sometimes that brighter color stands out just enough, but it's muted so that it can still mimic a shad slightly. That helps a little bit when that water is dirty. I've seen it play a lot of times in some very dirty water when I know the fish are feeding on shad. They might not eat the red, but you can throw the chartreuse and it'll still catch fish. And then my favorite color for around the spawn, bluegill spawn, post-spawn bass is going to be a bluegill color. You absolutely have to have one of those as well. If you fish ponds, that's an excellent color to have. Anywhere that those bass are constantly feeding on bluegill, got to have that color. They make a million other colors as well, so you could use potentially any one that you're looking for, but that bluegill color really mimics those fish well. You can catch a bunch of fish on that bluegill crankbait when they're feeding heavily, spawn, post-spawn, bluegill spawn. That's when I'm going to focus on that crankbait there. And lastly, let's go put all this together. So we talked about the rod, reel, and line setup. Now let's talk about where we want to fish this. We're going to get out on the water, throw this Squarebill around, and hopefully we're going to catch a couple of fish. We'll show you how to approach logs that are in the water, other types of cover that these fish can be in, how you want to retrieve this, and most importantly, a couple tips to get you more bites on a Squarebill. So let's get after it and see if we can catch us a couple. So now that we talked about the gear and bait selection when fishing a Squarebill, let's actually fish this thing around and see if we can get a bite on it. More importantly, show you the important parts of how to fish a Squarebill. We have been fishing all day. We've been throwing the Squarebill around a little bit, and we have not had much luck on it. So there's a good chance we probably will not catch a fish. We're gonna try anyway, but there's a few key techniques that I like to do when I'm fishing my Squarebill to make sure I'm catching more fish. The one mistake that I often make with a Squarebill, it's probably like the biggest mistake that you can make when fishing a Squarebill, is just getting in the habit of like going down the bank and casting it up there and reeling it back in at the same speed, do nothing different, just reel it in and then cast again. That's probably the biggest mistake you can make when fishing a Squarebill, just because it doesn't give the fish any reason to bite that bait. Of course you're gonna catch some fish doing that. They find, if a piece of food goes past their face, they're gonna bite it. So if they think it's something that's edible, whether it deflects off of something or not, they're probably gonna bite that bait. and you're gonna catch some fish. But you're gonna catch even more fish if you find stuff that you can hit in the water, especially on a day like today when the water's very dirty. We have very, very muddy water, and it's gonna be hard for these fish to find this bait. So the key to me being able to catch more fish, not only is getting it in areas where those fish live and putting it right in front of them, but it's gonna be to try and get them to react to it. And to do that, you want to bang your Squarebill into pieces of cover, whether it's wood, whether it's rock. It truly depends on where you're fishing, on what type of stuff you're going to bang it off of. I've fished a Squarebill around riprap numerous times, and what I would do in that scenario, if this was all riprap, I would actually kind of get up closer to the bank and 45-degree cast down the riprap, so my Squarebill hit the rocks as many times as possible on the way back in, rather than like I'm doing right now, which is casting directly at the bank and pulling it at 90 degrees. So on a riprap bank or a big rock bank, that's going to be more effective because your bait's going to stay in the strike zone longer. On a bank like this, I'm fishing specific laydowns that I can see up on the bank up here, and I'm making sure my crankbait makes contact with the laydown as much as possible the entire way down the limb, because that fish could be anywhere on that limb. So what I'm doing is I'm targeting each laydown and I'm making a dedicated cast to it, and then I'm slowly working the bait down the laydown and feeling it bump into everything down there. And that's when you're gonna get your bites. That's when you're gonna make that fish react, and that's how you're gonna catch a bunch of big bass on a Squarebill crankbait. So just depends on your type of cover. Biggest thing to remember is just try and make as much contact with that piece of cover as you can the entire way back to the boat, and you're gonna get more bites than if you're just reeling that crankbait through space. It's not gonna get as many bites doing that. So we're gonna get to casting here. We're gonna work hard and hopefully pull one fish out here at the end of the day to show you how this Squarebill works. And while getting hung up with a Squarebill is 100% gonna happen, if you're not getting hung up with your Squarebill, you should be concerned, because if you're not getting hung up, whether it's rock, whether it's wood, it means you're probably not putting your bait in the right area. Unfortunately, you're gonna lose a few of these. Sometimes they can get expensive depending on what you're buying, but that's just the way that the Squarebill works. And most of the time it will deflect off the piece of cover, and most of the time it will come right back out like that guy did right there. Sometimes you will lose them, but that's just the nature of the beast. If you're throwing a Squarebill, it should start with a square bill, and by the time you're done fishing it after one day of fishing, the bill should be all rounded off on it, on the corners. Doesn't mean it's not fishable anymore, but if your Squarebill still has a perfectly squared off lip by the end of the day fishing and you fished it hard around cover, you're probably not getting it in there far enough. So they're gonna grind off the bill. That's the key to this thing. You literally wanna beat the bill right off of this bait, and that's just gonna get you the most amount of bites when fishing this technique. So we're gonna get back to it, see what happens. There we go. I literally felt that bounce off a log, and as soon as it popped off the log, he grabbed it. That's the key with this thing. This is not a big fish by any means with that Squarebill, but we had been working hard for these fish today. We were finally able to get one on a Squarebill, tiny one, but as soon as it deflected off that piece of wood, he grabbed it. That's the key with this bait. Deflection, make them react to it. You could see he was barely hooked, but he just couldn't resist to bite it because it bounced right past his face and he got one hook in him. So that's the way that it works. I hope you guys enjoyed today's video talking about the Squarebill crankbait. If you want to see another crankbait that I like using for smallmouth bass, check this video out right here. Hit that subscribe button down below, and thanks for watching. See you, little dude.